Like feminism and socialism, political correctness comes with a definition and sales pitch that can be used by its promoters as a shield against criticism of abuses they commit in its name. Encyclopedia Britannica defines it as a term used to refer to language that seems intended to give the least amount of offense, especially when describing groups identified by external markers such as race, gender, culture, or sexual orientation. Social justice types argue that it constitutes a social contract, one that evolved organically as a result of changing attitudes in society. The argument is intended to frame political correctness culture, or PC culture, as a social norm from which any person's deviance implies that he is possessed of ignorant, outdated attitudes and probably malicious. It even sounds kind of reasonable, perhaps diplomatic, given that demographic prejudices are unpopular modes of thinking. Nobody wants to think of himself as a bigot. What we're told it is would be kind of reasonable, if that description were accurate. Politeness, diplomacy. If these were all we were talking about, there would be no problem. Everyone could learn the rules of social engagement, and those rules would facilitate civil discussion, even where politics are concerned. Such a result seems like an admirable goal, and it would be great if that were the intent. Unfortunately, pretty much the opposite is true. HBR Talk with Hannah Wallen. As Angelo Codevilla explained in his article, The Rise of Political Correctness, published by the Independent Institute, the term originated in the early 20th century communist idea that the party's interest is to be treated as a reality that ranks above reality itself. He went on to describe how progressives and communists, finding themselves at odds with their overall societies, use politically enforced changes in language to enforce changes in culture that they cannot achieve through open debate. Progressive movements, he explained, end up struggling not so much to create the promised new realities as to force people to speak and act as if these were real, as if what is correct politically, or what thoughts serve the party's interest, were correct factually. This is the true nature of political correctness. It's not about diplomacy, it's about control. It also didn't develop organically in the United States. It immigrated from Germany, brought here by a group of people dedicated to a school of neo-Marxist theory known as the Frankfurt School, so named for its emergence from the Institute for Social Research of the University of Frankfurt. As explained by New World Encyclopedia, these were dissident Marxists, severe critics of capitalism who opposed the classical interpretation of Marxist thought in terms of economic determinism and the special role of Communist Party. They cherry-picked their way through Marx's ideas, then mixed the parts they liked in with other schools of thought to fill in what they considered Marx's omissions. The resulting conglomeration is Western Marxism, or cultural Marxism. This school of thought might have remained a largely European phenomenon but for the rise of Hitler and subsequent changes to Germany's political environment. As the two groups of collectivists were wildly incompatible and many of the Frankfurt School were Jewish and therefore in mortal danger under Hitler's regime, the cultural Marxists fled Germany, many heading to the United States. Here they began involving themselves in the post-secondary education system, not simply due to having been academics prior to immigration, but out of an interest in occupying influential positions, where they could manipulate changes to curriculum, personnel, and policy, as part of a course of action influenced by the ideas of Italian communist Antonio Gramsci. This begins with Gramsci's ideas of cultural hegemony, or the domination of a culturally diverse society by the ruling class, who manipulate the culture of that society so that the imposed ruling class worldview becomes the accepted cultural norm. It is assumed that to change the culture, one must change the cultural norms, and to do that, one must gain the influence of the ruling class. Communist student activist Rudi Dutschke labeled this process the Long March Through the Institutions. Herbert Marcuse, one of the original Frankfurt School researchers, described it in his 1972 book, Counter-Revolution and Revolt, as a strategy of working against the established institutions while working within them, promoting infiltration by becoming a legitimate integral part of the institution. He went on to advocate building counter-institutions using media as an example. The fact that the radical left has no equal access to the great chains of information and indoctrination, he wrote, is largely responsible for its isolation. This is the mechanism by which political correctness was infused into American culture. The process was not organic and agreed upon, but slowly and methodically trained into generation after generation of American students. It involves a quiet process of installing like-minded political ideologues into every influential institution within a society, from educational and media institutions to community and labor organizations to government agencies. Then, from these influential positions, the group's ideals can be promoted as the enlightened way of thinking and discussing politics. This, then, becomes the standard for political correctness, and a culture has been created around virtue signaling by displaying one's grasp of that standard. PC culture has been used to control the language of social and political debate ever since. Among other things, this way of thinking has led to a hierarchy of human value based on each demographic's claim to or lack of historical victimhood, which PC culture labels marginalization, as defined by current standards for political correctness. This is called the progressive stack. Marxists describe it as a technique used to give marginalized groups a greater chance to speak, but treat it as a guide for and limiter on their extension of compassion such that their overall response to an individual relies almost entirely on his or her position in the progressive stack. This trail does not lead to the start of feminism, which is actually older than the formation of the Frankfurt Group. Feminists will tell you the two groups are entirely unrelated, but feminism is also a Marxist ideology. It takes the idea of class struggle and plugs gender demographics into the positions of oppressor and victim instead of class. In effect, it is the same victim narrative with different characters. That's why, as feminism evolved during the second wave, it began to incorporate elements of cultural Marxist political correctness, leading to its current intersectionality narrative. That narrative combines the progressive stack with the concept of the female demographic as an oppressed class to arrive at a means of presuming women the most marginalized and therefore the most deserving of compassion in every topic of political interest. The second wave weaponized Gramsci's Long March as a means of gaining power and control in education, media, and the federal bureaucracy. They've used these positions as a way of influencing the evolution of culture from generation to generation, as well as politics and the creation of law and policy. They've used PC culture to quash debate over the consequences of that influence. For example, women's studies professors and their feminist disciples had a direct influence on legislative changes like the move from the gender-neutral standards of the 1984 Family Violence Prevention and Services Act to the gender discriminatory standards of the 1994 Violence Against Women Act. This was promoted not by rational arguments in its favor, but through academic fraud and fear-mongering across mainstream media. Ever since, its defense has relied on accusing its critics of thought crimes, racism, sexism, homophobia, misogyny, and weaponized false allegations which are themselves defended with the politically correct notion that it's misogynist to not presume a woman's word infallible, when she's accusing a man of abusing her, of course. The next wave, that is, the next generation of the far left, feminists included, ended up as a hodgepodge of progressive Marxist politically correct groupthink equipped with a complex victim identity-based rule set designed to cripple its subscribers' ability to rationally examine any political concept. This is an evolved form of the bureaucratic mind virus. Any information to which the individual is exposed must be filtered through that rule set in order to determine the correct response, and if it isn't simple enough to fit the existing mold, it must be battered into a more accommodating form. This is why complaints about law, policy, and social norms that disadvantage men are met with cries of toxic masculinity. It is why the narrative behind that label exists. No matter what position a man's racial, sexual, and religious demographics give him within the progressive stack, women's position has to be closer to the totally marginalized end, so there had to be a narrative that could be used to masculinize toxicity in order to detach any perception of victimhood from men's experience of disadvantage. To assist in enforcing this, these addled cultists have even entrenched themselves in the departments responsible for censoring speech on social media. After all, political discussion online cannot lead to any conclusions their ideology wouldn't approve. You know, because the social contract is so organic and its acceptance so prevalent that we need literal thought police whose job is to prevent people from speaking if they're deemed guilty of wrongthink. Gird your loins, fellow wrongthink boogeymen. Before you is the dungeon crawl from hell. the cluttered maze into which we venture as we advocate for public support of legal and social reform. Are you ready for this? This week, HBR Talk will examine the concept of political correctness, what it is, why you're constantly told it's the norm, and how it's used to subjugate men. We stream on multiple platforms. You can tune in to the YouTube live stream via the link in the low bar, or find other viewing and listening options on badgerfeed.com.